Liz, hello everyone. Welcome to Conway Hall. I hope you are all well, keeping well in the current strangeness. Obviously, we're not actually at Conway Hall. Liz is in her very lovely conservatory. I am admiring it. I'd love to drink a gin and tonic in it one day. I am in my shed in South London, and I hope you're all comfy where you are. For those of you who have not been to Conway Hall before, to the London Fortean Society before, essentially we follow the writings of Charles Fort and the Fortean Times. And sorry, while I'm doing this, I'm trying to work out how to stop sharing my screen. Sorry, everyone. And we are interested in the paranormal, differing beliefs, anything that's a bit strange and inexplicable, but also not against science either. We're sort of into understanding things in a way, but not in a judgy way. It's all quite complicated. How we essentially interpret all that strangeness is by putting on talks by people we find interesting and letting people make up their own mind about what that person has spoken about. So how the evening is going to go is Liz is going to speak for about 45 minutes based on her book, Miracles of Our Own Making, A History of Paganism. She's probably not going to cover the entire history of paganism during her talk. Then we'll take questions from the people who are our viewers, our audience. I don't quite know what to call you. Please, if you can see the Q&A function on your screens, type your question in there and let us know whether you're able to let us open your microphone so you can ask your question directly to Liz. And that's what we'll do after the talk. And with that in mind, really pleased to welcome Liz Williams. I don't actually have your biography in front of you here, Liz. I'm really sorry.
That's okay.
Her book, Miracles of Our Own Making, is great. It's scholarly, but also dryly humorous, and it covers everything fairly and most importantly clearly. So really looking forward to this talk. So do please welcome to the Fortean shed and to your living rooms, Liz Williams. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say thank you to the big thank you to the London Fortean Society for
Liz,
having me.
I can't hear you. Can anyone else hear? Everyone else hear, Liz?
Can you hear me? Yep, you can. You can hear me.
There we go. There we go.
Okay.
Maybe that's just me.
All right, fantastic. Yeah, I just want to say thank you to the London Fortean Society for having me. I've been interested in Forteana actually myself for a long, long time, ever since I read a book which was a science fiction novel called, I think, Charles Fort Never Mentioned Wombats. And it wasn't Robert Rankin. I can't remember who it was, but it struck me that as an interesting thing, and I actually looked up the name, not on the internet because I am that old, and I think I looked it up in an encyclopedia in the library. And after that, I started buying the Fortean Times, and I haven't bought it every issue ever since, but I have bought it a lot. And it's a great read. So it's really nice to be talking to the Fortean Society today. Now, the talk that I'm going to be giving you is based, as Scott said, not on the entire history of paganism. This book, Miracles of Our Own Making, which I completely admitted to bring downstairs with me, so you can't see it, but here's an imaginary book, basically does cover an enormous quantity of ground. We had to keep it to the British Isles. I didn't really go into Ireland that much, but it's trying to cover the history of paganism from very early times right up until the contemporary present day. Modern paganism is a revivalist religion. It hasn't lasted all that time. So if you're thinking of paganism and you're thinking of it in the context of my book, just to do a really quick illustration, this is ancient paganism, the Celtic tribes, the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, the Romans. Then where this hand is the Christianization of Britain. Then we have an enormously long period, hundreds and hundreds of years, in which Britain is basically a Christian country. And unfortunately, as I'm going to mention, there's no real evidence of pagan survival within this period. But what we have got within this period is magical practice. Magic doesn't go away when Britain becomes Christianized. And then over this side of the screen, for the last 120 years, paganism starts putting in a reappearance as a revivalist religion. So if you kind of think of that, that basic model, which I'm trying to illustrate very badly with my hands during the course of this talk, which is going to look primarily at witchcraft and Wicca, then just bear that in mind. I'm going to be going into some of this as I'm speaking. So I'm going to turn the video off now because I'm actually reading this talk. I haven't done this on Zoom before now. And I would hope that I'm going to try and keep an eye on Zoom and on your comments, just to make sure that if I disappear suddenly, somebody can shout, "You're not there anymore," or let me know. As I say, first time on Zoom to do a talk like this. I'd much rather be standing before you on a stage at Conway Hall soon, let's hope. Okay, so there are so many claims made about witchcraft and Wicca, to name but two of the contemporary pagan paths, that it can be really bewildering for the new inquirer, and it's difficult to know where to start. And part of the trouble is that Wicca in particular started off rather on the defensive, and a number of claims were made for it when it began that are either simply false or they're impossible to prove. And that's not necessarily because its early proponents wanted to deceive people, but it was an attempt to legitimize what was seen as a controversial spirituality by grounding it in allegedly ancient lore. Modern paganism is one of those spiritual paths which privileges antiquity. It maintains that the older something is, or the longer that we can show people to have been practicing it, the better it must be. And I think that this supposition itself needs to be challenged. I have to say, there's no blame here. This is a supposition that I myself actually held for a long time. And I kind of thought, oh yeah, it's older, therefore it's got to be better, till I actually started unpacking that. But why does old equate with good or more authentic? You know, what does it say about us that we need to anchor our modern beliefs in the ancient world? This is a world which bore very little resemblance to our own, and it had a lot of customs that we'd regard as fairly appalling today. So why is it that pagans, along with the New Age, regard the beliefs of primitive tribes, whether historical or contemporaneous, as somehow superior to our own? So much of the tone of miracles has been devoted to the attempt to give an overview of where contemporary pagan and magical beliefs and practices in 21st century Britain actually came from, rather than a lot of origin myths, some inaccuracies, and some, I'm afraid, outright fabrications, which currently float about the pagan ether. It's common for people who are new to paganism to encounter some really extraordinary claims and assertions. Some organizations seem to be competing for the title of oldest known. Some individuals go to remarkable lengths. I actually knew a young man who made an ancient book of shadows, constructed out of parchment, stained it with tea to make it look old, with which he used to attract people to his teenage coven. And there were several hundred pages of this thing. It was like a 400-page book. For a 17-year-old boy, it was an amazing artistic achievement. It wasn't a book of shadows in an ancient sense, but it was remarkable. You know, you've got to question his honesty, but at the same time, certain respect there. But we find these claims for antiquity in all pagan paths, in contemporary ceremonial magic, in druidry, and in Wicca, and all of these actually possess reasonably clear lines of historical descent. So I suggested in my book that we also consider the words of 20th century occultist William Gray, one of the greatest occultists of the last 100 years, on the subject of the lineage of our magical traditions and organizations. And Gray said, it's incorrect to assume that any organization must be authentic merely because it can trace a line of descent several hundred years long. The organization's ancestry proves only that it is authentically old, not that it's authentically good or necessarily of great spiritual value. There may be a strong probability that something is worth preserving in its structure, otherwise it would scarcely have survived. But again, all this does is demonstrate its durability and persistence, nothing else. A 500-year-old house, says Gray, that has never been modernized might be a very interesting museum exhibit, but who in his or her right mind in our times would care to live in it permanently? Simply because an esoteric concern is old in name or ideology is no guarantee of its goodness or its continuing spiritual significance. As a human institution, it cannot be older than its most senior member, since it is an inheritance that passes from one generation to the next, and however much they may claim continuity, the people mediating its meaning in modern times are not the same as those who formed and framed it in earlier epochs. So there are some major questions about the antiquity of paganism as a religion. It's likely, obviously, that our ancestors in the British Isles and parts of Europe practiced a spirituality that was based in the natural world. People react to what is around them, and the environment in which our ancestors lived was obviously crucial to their survival. So you see many early religions having gods and goddesses of the sky, the earth, the sun, and the moon, the great natural powers with which they're surrounded. Our ancestors lived and died in harsh and often very unforgiving conditions. Anyone who seemed to have answers, or anyone who seemed to have power within that environment, would have been valued. Shamans, wise folk with a knowledge of herb lore, people who were believed to possess precognitive ability and could tell the future, and people who were seen as having the power to placate and influence the deities, the gods. These would be central to their society. In the British Isles, Celtic, Anglo-Saxon and Norse religions would all have been practiced. They didn't necessarily refer to themselves as those names, but that's what we call them today. And there are traces of the religions that the Romans brought with them, the worship of Isis, of Mithras, of Mars, to name but a few. I'm not very far from Bath here. The patron goddess of Bath is Sulis Minerva, who is a combination of a Celtic tribal deity, possibly a deity of the spring, a spirit of the spring, and Minerva, the goddess of wisdom. The Romans were very good at incorporating local gods into their own pantheons. We know about the Druids from the Romans, but the Druidic path was oral. Nothing was written down. And thus it's a problem because we only see their spirituality through the eyes of the people who were often hostile towards it. The Romans were conquerors. And much of what they wrote has got to be taken with a pinch of salt. Invaders are very rarely sympathetic to indigenous religions, although it's fair to say that the Romans were a bit more tolerant than most. Even the famous slaughter by the Roman army of Druids on the island of Mona, of Anglesey, may have been invented by the historian Tacitus. Historian did not mean the same then that it does now. Now you expect somebody who really looks at reliability and accuracy. Tacitus had a different agenda. And there's no archaeological evidence for a massacre. And unfortunately, there's no evidence for the existence of ancient priestesses. Not in the Druidic traditions, we presume that they existed in some form. The Romans mention that there were women among the Druids, but in each citation, unfortunately, the role of the Druidess is to prophesy the rise of a powerful man. So women in the Celtic world weren't quite as rigidly restricted as their Roman counterparts, but the idea that they were Druidic priestesses may not be correct, unfortunately. And queens such as Boudica and Cartimandua were the exception rather than the norm. You know, it's like political leaders such as Benazir Bhutto tend to be the exceptions within Islamic societies, which are also quite restrictive. However, although we know so relatively little about it in actual terms, Druidry does seem to have been a path that took the natural world into consideration. The Romans said that they were astronomers, and empirically they would have known a lot about the world around them. The modern wheel of the year that most pagans now follow is said to have been based on the year of the ancient Celts. Again, this is a bit problematic. And if you're looking for something to read on this, then I highly recommend Professor Ronald Hutton's Stations of the Sun for a careful analysis of which festivals were probably actually followed. The solstices seem to have been taken into consideration, the equinoxes to some degree. The observance of other festivals is very patchy, doesn't take place across the whole country, tribally specific, no matter what a lot of our pagan authors claim today. And the same is true, really, of the Saxons and Norse traditions. We've got more evidence for their pantheons because they did tend to write stuff down. I'm going through a whistle-stop tour here of paganism and magical practice. Bear in mind that This is going to be very, very superficial. So do feel free to go into more depth in your questions if you have those. After Britain's Christianized, there is really little evidence, almost no evidence, that paganism somehow went underground and continued to be practiced. What does seem to have happened is that early Christianity took on some earlier practices and absorbed them. So, for example, during the 11th and 12th centuries, people still practiced magic like herbalism and charms, talismans. But in spite of earlier Saxon edicts against it, some of the kings came down quite hard against magic. Very few people at this moment seem to have focused, very few people were actually brought before the ecclesiastical courts in Britain. Persecuting magical practitioners at this time, it just wasn't a thing. The church seems to have focused its efforts on heresy rather than folk magic, kind of ignored folk magic. And a diverse range of people in early medieval times are technically involved in various kinds of magical practice. Monks, midwives, physicians, surgeons, priests, diviners, and folk healers. Some of those are modern titles for older things, but all of these people turn up as magical practitioners. We've got some written sources now to help us to understand what's going on, but this means that quite a lot of historical evidence is weighted towards the church because clerical personnel were literate members of a largely illiterate society, and there are likely to have been some biases in what they said. But it doesn't mean that those sources don't contain some valuable information. I'm just looking at the panel, and somebody's asked for a book reference. It's Ronald Hutton, Stations of the Sun. And I recommend anything written by Ronald on early paganism. He's very, very good. So for example, going back to our subject, monks were expected to be able to have a knowledge of herbalism. If you think about Brother Cadfael, if anybody's old enough, young enough to remember that, and healing cures. The 12th century priest, the guy in the church, would be expected to conduct a version of the old Saxon land ceremonies charm. This is a fertility ritual for barren fields. It takes a whole day, and the priest goes around sprinkling holy water, honey, milk, and herbs over the field while reciting passages from the Bible. And the practice is seen as Christian because he's using Bible verses, but it's basically still magic, and it first appears in the Lacnunga, which is a name given to the text in the 19th century, although it dates from the 10th. It was written by monks, and it calls upon the Lord and the apostles. But it's likely, and some people believe, that the Christian component of this, the names of the Lord and the apostles, was a substitution for earlier pagan elements. Given the date of the charm, they could easily be right. So we have some Saxon charms calling upon Thor and Woden and Loki and the Saxon gods that later turn up as part of clerical practice. They're still magical practice, and it indicates that the church adopted at least some Saxon practices and carried them forwards. So in early times, it's not really who you were, but it's what you did that seems to have mattered to the clerical authorities. And the water is further muddied by some of the church's own teachings. This statement comes from around about 900 AD in the Canon Episcopi. It says, "It's also not to be admitted that some unconstrained women, perverted by Satan, no way, seduced by illusions and phantasms of demons, believe and openly profess that in the dead of night they ride upon certain beasts with the pagan goddess Diana," is a reference to a pagan goddess, "with a countless horde of women, and in the silence of the dead of the night to fly over vast tracts of country and to obey her commands as their mistress and to be summoned to her service on other nights. But it were well if they alone perished in their infidelity and did not draw so many others into the pit of their faithlessness. For an innumerable multitude, deceived by this false opinion, believe this to be true, and so believing wander from the right faith and relapse into pagan errors when they think that there is any divinity or power except the one God." So what this is saying basically is that witchcraft isn't real and witches don't actually exist, but some people are delusional or wrong and think that they do. And what this does is it puts a big block in the way of ecclesiastical courts prosecuting folk for being witches. you can't prosecute someone for being something that doesn't officially exist. So in the world of late antiquity, or the early Middle Ages, some commentators say, it's impossible to define someone as a witch, as opposed, for example, to an amateur herbalist, a heretic, or just a scold, and none of the legislation of the time attempted to do so. Offenders were designated offenders by virtue of them performing various actions or wearing certain objects declared by the legislation to be condemned or forbidden. So for all practical purposes, the term witch hadn't yet been invented. There were only practitioners of various kinds of magic, both male and female. They might belong to any rank of ecclesiastical or lay society, and whose actions might or might not bring them within the compass of canon and secular law, depending on external factors that were usually local, but could from time to time be a bit more general. So we know that the church was concerned with magical practices at this time. A lot of these were to do with healing, but in a pre-scientific era, it's actually quite hard to distinguish between magical forms of healing and natural or Christian ones. For example, Catholic historian Eamon Duffy has pointed out that some healing charms look a lot like prayers and exorcisms, and thus were acceptable to some clerics. The physician Bernard of Gordon in Montpellier rejected incantations, but allowed astrological talismans, although some clerics denounced even these. The issue of sortilegium, magical practices including divination, healing cures, belief in fairies, and misuse of church rituals, is a thorny one. There's a diversity of opinion among clerics even at the time. So, moving on. A lot of the people who got targeted during the witch trials of the later medieval, Elizabethan, and Civil War periods are unlikely to have been actual witches. Hayley's just popped on the panel that wasn't the term witch a derogatory term. Anyway, it's often today mixed up with Christian cunning folk. That is absolutely right. The term white witch was used by Puritans as a derogatory form about cunning folk. It's to say, I'll come to that in a little while, but it's basically to say they might be pretending to be good, but they're still witches. You know, they might be white, but what so what? They're still witches. That wouldn't have been what people called themselves. So there's a difference. And what we need to realize that a lot of magical practitioners per se were not targeted during the witch trials. There was a difference between what were known as cunning folk and witches. The former, the cunning folk, were allowed to continue practicing magic at a time when persecutions for witchcraft in this country were at their height. And this might seem a bit weird. It's like the witch trials that aren't to do with witches. But if we unpack the nature of the magical practitioner over the course of these centuries, it begins to make a bit more sense. So in essence, the belief system goes like this. Witches are evil. They practice black magic. They consort with the devil. Cunning folk are good. They practice benevolent magic. They mainly protect people from black magic, and they help those who have been cursed by witches. People would know about them mainly by word of mouth. So how many witches did we have in Britain at this time? Were they really as common as all that, of folk being cursed all the time? And if the church had previously said that witches weren't real, how could they start prosecuting them? So partly this was due to the church changing its mind. The idea that a pact with the devil could be made had started to become increasingly popular as we kind of creep up to the time that the witch trials were starting. So it's not really an individual who's the source of this black magic, but it's Satan working through the individual. New texts coming into the country in translation from the Islamic world, such as the Arabic grimoire Gayat al-Hakim, which is known as the Picatrix, were giving cause for concern among clerics. Things of which heretics had been accused now become things of which witches are accused: eating babies, having orgies, cannibalism, demon worship. Horrible stuff, mainly unprovable or downright untrue, but it's really useful if you want to get rid of someone. So from 1300 onwards, the fear of witchcraft and the targeting of people suspected of it continues to rise, reaches its peak from about 1450 to the mid-1600s. Britain actually got off relatively lightly compared to the continent, of thousands of trials across Europe during this time. And although a lot of people were killed here, more in Scotland, it's in 4 figures in Scotland, several hundred to, I think, over 1,000 in England, And it's actually, I asked Ronald this, and he said in Wales, 5 witches were killed. Still 5 too many, but it's not a lot compared to Europe. So the answers to how many actual witches there were isn't fixed, but it's likely, as far as we can tell from the historical evidence, that may change, that there really weren't large numbers of people forming covens, cursing and blighting all and sundry, and holding sabbats in the woods. So if the nice cunning person, I'm just looking at one of the questions, they can be male or female. If they give you charms against black magic and they make you healing herbal concoctions and they help you with your animals, if they weren't persecuted, who was? So in Britain, what Philip Carr-Gomm calls competent middle-aged, middle-class women were more often picked on, usually because they had a reputation for a hot temper and a sharp tongue. Such women may also fall into the category of people disliked by their neighbours. Want your next door neighbour's land, had a row with them about money, you call in the witchfinder general, who'll get paid for everybody that he denounces successfully, and you let him sort it out. It's a little bit like now, actually, if you have seen people getting really, really cross about people breaking lockdown rules and suggesting that they should be denounced to the authorities. Now, sometimes that's justified. Sometimes those people are a problem. Sometimes they're not. Agnes Nutter, which I always think is an unfortunate name, up in Pendle, was, as Hayley's just remarked, she was the landowner. We went up to Pendle some years ago. We had a look at her house from afar, because it's still there, but it's a private residence. It's a lovely house. It's not a hovel. It's a big, big property with a lot of land. And she, I think if I've got this correct, she had a row with the local magistrate who wanted her land. Suddenly she's denounced as a witch. She probably wasn't a witch, but her behavior was suspicious, and that is probably because she was a Catholic heretic. So you're getting all sorts of people kind of sucked into the category of witches when they weren't witches. And other targets include people who are mentally ill, members of the criminal classes who extort money by means of magical intimidation. There were a few of those. Give me a penny or I'll put a spell on you. People who genuinely believed in magic and who did actually undertake cursing, because earlier magical practitioners didn't have the same squeamishness about cursing people that a lot of modern Wiccans do today. And without question, some people did practice a form of what is commonly called black magic. If you go around the Museum of Boscastle, a Museum of Witchcraft in Boscastle down in Cornwall, that will convince you pretty quickly that not all witches' magic was healing magic. And also affected, as in the case of poor Agnes, were heretics. What there isn't any evidence is that these people were genuinely following any form of ancient pagan religion. So after this absolutely whistle-stop several centuries, is there any connection between the ancient religions and the modern practices of witchcraft? We've seen that magical practice continues right through the centuries. But witchcraft itself, okay, most similarities are likely to be examples of parallel evolution, not evidence of direct descent. We mustn't entirely rule this out because evidence in the future might prove us wrong. And I suspect that there are actually some very old customs like well dressing, which come from very early times. What I actually don't believe at the moment is that there is an unbroken lineage of witchcraft which has come down to us from the time of the Celts, or an unbroken lineage of druidry which has come down to us from the time of the Druids. So where does it come from? If somebody tells you that they come from a family tradition, should you believe them? Okay, so over the last few centuries, as we've just alluded to, the British Isles are filled with cunning folk and wise women who probably acted a little bit like contemporary shamans do. And they healed and some of them possibly hexed in equal measure. Though I think when the witch trials started kicking in, a lot of people would have backed off from that. Some of the magic strikes us as unpleasant. Some of it is literally charming. My own family are said to have the evil eye. People who crossed my relatives, so my father always told me, tended to die. But my family weren't witches. They were Methodists in southwest Wales. And in the Celtic regions in particular, magic and superstition and religion are intertwined like an intricate piece of Celtic knotwork. So it is likely, I think, that there are descendants of cunning folk around in Britain today, and it is feasible that some of them may have inherited books of magic or simply family customs from their great-grandparents. But quite how far such traditions would go back is a matter of conjecture. And in addition to this village magic, you've got ceremonial magicians practicing magic from Renaissance times onwards, sometimes using the old books known as grimoires, summoning spirits and angels and demons. You're probably all aware that Sir Isaac Newton was fascinated by alchemy and returned to the occult at the end of his life. Felt this, rather than science, was where the answers lay. But science and magic weren't as clearly cut then as they are now. Some of this magic makes an appearance in later times. It resurfaces in the work of Freemasonry and subsequently in late 19th century occult societies, such as the Order of the Rosy Cross, the Golden Dawn, influenced by the work of writers such as Israel Regardie. If you're interested in grimoires, and I'll put this onto the chat in a minute, there's some really interesting work done by Owen Davis, who was Professor of Social History at the University of Hertfordshire and is one of the recognised authorities in this country on grimoires. So I have a friend whose grandmother actually was a weather-working witch in the north of England. She did spells for fishermen. Her practices were regarded with horror by her family, and they didn't take it up. Our ancestors were as they were. Some of what she did was apparently quite unpleasant. They didn't live in the same culture as we do. And I do think we should be careful not to condemn them too heavily, because their actions offend modern sensibilities, but we shouldn't romanticize them either, seeing them through some sort of rosy haze of some mythical past in which every cunning woman was a priestess healer and every ceremonial magician was nobly making a stand against the intolerance of the church. It's much, much more complicated than that. I'd recommend a brief study of both Freemasonry and 19th century occultism to anyone who wants to understand modern witchcraft and Wicca. The Golden Dawn is probably the most influential movement, but some of the Eastern groups, such as the work done by Madame Blavatsky, also have a big influence on witchcraft in the 20th century. And a lot of modern witchcraft draws upon Eastern ideas, such as the chakras and the law of karma. They don't get it from the New Age, they get it from 19th century thought. Much of what we now think of as Wiccan comes originally from Freemasonry, including the use of the chalice, the sword, and some of the terminology. So mote it be is a Masonic term. There's a little rhyme that tells us happy we may part, like the modern Wicca, merry meet and merry part. It's probable too that the pentagram, which is very, very old, comes to Wicca through a Masonic line. Wicca and witchcraft really begin for us in the modern day in the 1950s with Gerald Gardner. A lot of you will be familiar with Gardner. Born in 1884, he's a rubber planter, expat civil servant for much of his life in Burma and Malaya. He's a typical product of upper middle class Victorian England. Like so many of those guys, he had an odd spiritual side. He had the kind of mysticism expressed in the writings of Arthur Machen and Algernon Blackwood. He explored Buddhism, Freemasonry, Druidry. He was an enthusiastic antiquarian. And he retired in 1936 to the New Forest near Bournemouth, where he apparently became involved with a group known as the Rosicrucian Order of Crotona Fellowship, and subsequently with a second group whom he said practiced witchcraft, described by Gardner as an ancient religion, the oldest folk path of the British Isles. And Ronald Hutton thinks that this was probably an invention of the Rosicrucian Fellowship, possibly by a woman called Duffo. Most of Gardner's tradition was probably written by Aleister Crowley and Doreen Valiente, as Gardner was initiator of the OTO under Crowley. Gardner himself made mention of a woman called Old Dorothy, who wasn't some ancient cunning woman living in the forest. She was Dorothy Forden, probably, was not absolutely 100% certain. And she was the wife of the local Tory MP and a pillar of the local church. And it's a bit eyebrow raising, actually, to see her as a proponent of a 1950s witch cult, but stranger things have happened. It's likely that she was actually Gardner's high priestess. She's a music teacher and a student of the esoteric. Gardner drew a lot of his practice from other areas. The 3-degree system probably derives from Freemasonry. And as I've said, he seems to have taken some of his magical practice from the East. This law of threefold return that a lot of Wiccans practice, it's the idea that if you put a curse on somebody, it returns to you 3 times. That doesn't work, unfortunately, really. But what Gardner did with that was to put a lid on a lot of the squabbling and backstabbing that might otherwise have taken place in British Wicca. There's also some evidence, again I'm owing this to Ronald, whom I'm quoting a lot, but rightly, that he adopted some of the correspondences to do with the elemental quarters from his boyhood in the woodcraft folk, This was a sort of alternative green version of the Scouts in the early 1900s, and it drew heavily on Native American law, which was then very fashionable. And it's why Wicca and the native traditions have such a close correlation in places. It comes essentially from this green version of the Scouts, oddly enough. The term Wicca itself is said to come from Anglo-Saxon, but Gardner was actually referring to the people involved in it, not the practice itself, as Wicca, W-I-C-K, and it's likely that the term Wicca comes from a rival practitioner, Charles Cardell, and was then reclaimed at a later date by Doreen Valiente. Gardner himself seems to have referred to it as the witch cult. Now, of course, the cult term has sinister connotations, and we don't use it. From its origins in the 1950s, the craft moves on. It's adopted by some of the people whom Gardner initiated and some whom he didn't. Alexander's is the other sort of big lineage in Wicca. You have Gardnerians and Alexandrians. Sanders himself was born in 1926 in Liverpool, came from a Welsh background, and claimed to have been initiated into witchcraft by his grandmother. One evening in 1933, I was sent round to my grandmother's house for tea. For some reason, I didn't knock at the door as I went in and was confronted by my grandmother, naked, with her grey hair hanging down to her waist, standing in a circle drawn on the kitchen floor. She proceeded to do something illegal and fairly unpleasant to young Alex. But it's difficult to know just how many of these claims are true. Sanders had a trickster-like aspect, which led him to embellish and embroider the facts. Priestess Patricia Crowther says she had letters from Sanders in the early 60s in which he made no mention of this familial initiation, and he claimed subsequently that he was initiated by a priestess in Nottingham. But it's really hard to know. He worked as a stage medium for a while and married a very young, very beautiful woman called Maxine. Maxine Sanders is still alive. And in 1965, when they married, she'd already been involved with a magical order associated with the Egyptian mythos. Sanders is problematic. His love of publicity and his constant tipping off of the news of the world that they were going to be doing rituals did bring the craft into the public eye, sometimes in a really sensationalist manner. And it's very debatable whether he actually did the movement any favours. But it's indubitable that a lot of people came to Wicca, came to have an interest in witchcraft as a result of the articles that they read in the newspaper. In 1988, Sanders died. Maxine continued to teach and run covens of her own. She still does. They initiated a number of people who carried the baton of the craft into the 1970s, 1980s and onwards, such as Stuart Farrar, a journalist whose responsible and sympathetic reporting of the craft did a lot to draw people towards it. Janet Farrar, his widow, still living in Ireland, works within the craft with her current husband, Gavin Bone. But now modern witchcraft and Wicca are taking many, many forms. American Wicca and witchcraft have contributed a great deal to the contemporary forms of it with the influential work of feminist writers such as Starhawk. So should we be disappointed when we learn that the craft's roots, the roots of Wicca and witchcraft, are not as ancient or glamorous as we might like to think? Nothing in human culture is static. Everything changes. This is a banal statement. Everything moves onward. Humans adapt religions to their own day and their own circumstances. And the appeal that witchcraft has to so many people now, in fact, this is true of Druidry and all the pagan paths, most of them. It relates to very contemporary concerns. Our worries about the environment, our need to return to a more natural, seasonal way of doing things, our redressing of the balance between male and female, our need for the empowerment of women. So just because current practitioners don't practice witchcraft in the same way as the cunning folk ancestors is irrelevant to an extent. Someday we're going to be the ancestors, the ancient ones. What we all have to say will be of equal interest to our descendants. What we mustn't do, I don't think, is to hearken to an imaginary past in justification of our own beliefs. Those are going to stand or fall according to our own needs and our own strengths. And we can use the significant works of pagan literature, fictional literature, such as the Mists of Avalon, to inspire and encourage us, but we shouldn't see them, and we shouldn't need to see them, as historical fact. Okay, I'm going to say that I'm finishing there. We've got about, we're just about on time, aren't we? So let me just click back to the screen. Scott, would you like to fire some questions at me? Was that okay?
Well, I just want to say thank you very much, first of all. That was a brief and brilliant talk. just about on time. I just encourage everyone again that Liz's book, it goes into much greater depth and it's brilliant. And I want at least one person bought it during your talk. It was
that is very
so
kind.
great.
Thank you very much. No, that is really sweet.
Very quickly, thank you for that. This talk is put on by the London Fortean Society in partnership with Conway Hall, which is a charity that exists to present thought-provoking talks to the public. Obviously, in this time, they have zero income coming in. If you haven't donated to this talk, do please do so. I'll be sharing the link in the chat and on the screen at the very end of this event. London Fortean Society, at the moment, obviously, I'm stuck in the shed and we can't go to the pub after this talk. I'm very sad about that.
Go to the fridge.
I've been to the fridge. But one day we hope to welcome Liz to London and see all of you in person. Saying that now, we've got some questions in already. Do please put your questions into the Q&A and let us know if you want us to open up your mic. First one though, I needed to read out, Liz, I don't know if you've seen this one from Urabe Swingler. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong, Urabe. Can you say something about the enclosures and more generally the politics of being a witch, especially where you might have lived and been evicted from, and who might have been the vested interest in doing this?
The enclosures, as in Scottish land grabs.
I'm assuming so.
Yes.
Let me know otherwise, Urabe.
I don't know very much about that at all. That is a fascinating question, and I would have to go and actually look into that a little bit because that's not something I know about. However, you can extrapolate that because a lot of this stuff was about power, land, getting people out of the way. It would not surprise me to find that people were kicked off the land because of false accusations, basically, of all different kinds. So I think it is a very, very plausible argument that the two were connected. But I would have to go and do some proper research into that. I don't know offhand. Okay,
thank you. I'm going to do another couple that I need to read out first, even though I hate reading them out. So Haley's asked to know, Mike, and asks, does the name Wicca originate from Wiki, W-I-K-C-C-E, Wike, suggested to mean wise woman?
It might do. I'd need to go into the linguistics of it, and Gardner did read quite extensively, and he did do some historical research, so it's possible that he did actually take it from there. It comes from somewhere, and I think it is a Saxon term. It's not Celtic, but it is a Saxon kind of word. So yes, quite possibly.
She goes on to ask, why do we claim the word witch as a derogatory term, which I think you covered a little bit during your talk?
I did cover that a bit. Yeah, it's a Puritan slur, basically. People would have called themselves, as far as I am aware, a cunning man or a cunning woman, if they were actually, doing healing work, protecting you from curses. I mean, I think what I really got from doing a lot of research into this is that magical practice is very much a service industry at a lot of levels. It's to get stuff for you, and it's to heal, it's to get money. Treasure hunting, conjuring treasure spirits is a big part of Elizabethan and Renaissance magical practice. To an extent, protecting people from cursing is a big part of it. It's like a lot of the services that we have today. We don't need magic because we've got the NHS, we've got the police, we've got other things that cover those areas. But in the past, if you don't have a doctor in the village, if you can't find your stuff or somebody's stolen it, who do you go to? The magical practitioner is kind of your go-to guy or woman for a lot of things.
Okay, I'm going to go now to Graham Taylor. Sorry, first of all, Graham, we've opened your mic.
Hello there, Liz.
Hello.
I really enjoyed your speech. It was fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you. A really spooky speech for these times.
Yeah, I know, spooky times.
Yeah. I've got a spooky question for you as well.
Okay.
With devil and God and witch and Jesus being preached in these rituals, do you think that good will still overrule evil once you have prayed to your Lord and practice good rituals?
Probably yes. I mean, the idea of even if you're doing what is technically known as black magic, I mean, there is such a thing as black magic. It's mainly demonic conjuration. So you conjure a demon, if you're of a mind to do so, to do something for you. If things get out of hand and you start getting really freaked out, what you are supposed to do is appeal to the archangel who is responsible for the demon's line management. So it's very much God, Christ, angels, lesser spirits, demons. So there's a direct kind of line of line management. This is a really odd idea, and a lot of people aren't familiar with it. But ultimately, the person on whom you call to combat evil is Christ, is God, is the Virgin, or an angel, or a saint. So even in Renaissance magic, which is fairly hardcore, the sort of celestial powers, the heavenly powers, are at the top. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does to say, yes, thank you. Cheers.
Okay, thank you very much, Graham.
Thank you, Karen.
Hey, Dawn Keatley has a question.
Hello.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for a great talk. I was really interested in your saying that, obviously your main argument, that witchcraft isn't rooted in paganism. And I'm just curious as to whether you have a handy definition of paganism. And since there's probably not a whole, you can't cover it all in a talk, in an answer. Do you talk about that more in your book?
I do a bit, yes. I mean, I tend to say that pagan is the umbrella, and then you have different paths underneath the umbrella. So if you say somebody's a pagan, you might mean that they're a witch, you might mean they're a Wiccan, you might mean they're a druid, a heathen, several other things that sort of fall into that kind of very broad category. But most of them in this country, in Britain, are revivalist religions in the 21st century, certainly. I hope that answered your question, Dawn.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
The next question is from Claire Loveday.
Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, right, sorry, I was expecting my question just to be answered. Now, I just wondered, is there any link, or has there ever been a link in history between paganism and magicians and political acts, socialist acts, Luddite acts?
Oh, that's very interesting. There is certainly pagan magicians existed in the ancient world, so I'll get that bit of the question out of the way. I suspect it is likely that some cunning folk were probably politically active because, witches and cunning folk tend to be kind of the people who question authority a bit. And then in the late 19th century, you do have quite a big crossover between members of the Golden Dawn and the Fabian Society. So people like George Bernard Shaw who were interested in, he wasn't a member of the Golden Dawn, I don't think, but he was kind of a fellow traveller. People like Yeats, they're interested in the occult, they're interested in revolutionary movements, they're interested in left-wing politics. And that kind of grows throughout the 20th and 21st century. So quite a lot of later witches like Starhawk are political activists now. But
Okay.
yeah, it's got its main roots in the late 19th century, but you could probably, I didn't really focus on that too much in the book, but you could probably take it back further if you did some digging, certainly. You get people like Anna Bonus Kingsford, who was probably the person who inspired, although she didn't belong to the Golden Dawn because she died just as they'd set it up. But she's an anti-vivisectionist, a vegetarian, politically very active. So you've got all sorts of people like that who are interested in left-wing politics.
Okay, thank you very much.
Not at all.
Thank you. Next question from Lucas Buchanan. Are you there, Lucas?
I can see his photo. Hello.
Hi, can you hear?
I can, yes, hello.
Hi, I'm Amy, I'm Lucas's wife.
Hello.
Thank you for your talk. I was interested that you mentioned medieval Christian magical practice.
Yes.
And I was wondering if that all derived from British paganism or if any of it came from elsewhere.
Well, a lot of it would have, if it's got roots into actual British paganism, they're a bit spindly. Some of it possibly would have come from elsewhere, from the continent, basically. And again, that's something I didn't really go into at all in the book, because otherwise the book would have been like this big. Unfortunately, because, I said this to somebody the other night, there's a lot of stuff in 19th century Paris in the occult world. There's a lot of stuff about alchemy, particularly in some of the Spanish cities, that is absolutely fascinating. And it all feeds into British magical practice. But it was just too much to put in the book. So I alluded to little bits of it. But yeah, I mean, the history of it is just massive. It's so broad. And it's definitely European-wide and from further afield than that. Everywhere's got its magical traditions. And I mean, if you're looking at the sort of the massive engine of Western occultism, then you would look at Egypt as an inspirer of organizations like the Golden Dawn. But there's a little bit of evidence that some Egyptian spells made their way into medieval magic as well here. And that is an ancient root, actually. That's really interesting stuff. But a lot of this stuff is untranslated. A huge amount of Arabic texts on alchemy that nobody has yet translated into Latin or English. So there's an awful lot we don't know, and there's a lot to be discovered.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question is from Shib the Brave.
Hi, it's Siobhan.
Oh, hello, Siobhan. How are you?
I'm all right. My Zoom name is Siob the Brave because my name's spelled Sioban and it always causes confusion. So yeah, but yes, hello. Thank you so much. That was fascinating, and I'm curious about the future of Wicca. Because we do live in these very strange times, horrid COVID times, and yes. What do you think? I mean, it's a very open question.
Oh, God, yeah, I mean, there is a sort of saying that if you can see your path ahead of you, it's not your path. And I think magic just tends to go off into some extraordinary directions. Who would have thought that the younger generation that like about 10 years ago suddenly all got into voodoo here. So it's really up for grabs. I know that COVID is obviously having an impact on things like this, but things like this are also pagan things. So they've done a lot of events. The Edinburgh Fire Festival, the Beltane Festival, was on Zoom. So they filmed as much as they could and put footage up from last year. Solstice is going on is being digitally streamed, but there's not going to be anybody at Stonehenge this year because they can't. And some of that stuff is just so weird. So God knows where it's going to lead. Very odd times.
I took part in a Zoom Back in the Green celebration on the 1st of May, which was nice to do, but did feel very strange.
It is weird. It's not analogous to meeting up with people and dancing around a fire. It really isn't.
It really isn't. Or a great big walking hedge. Caitlin has a question.
Hello.
Hello.
Do you need to unmute?
Caitlin, can you hear us? You can hear you, Caitlin.
Yes, great. Okay.
Oh, yes. Hello.
Hello. This question actually kind of follows on some of that previous discussion just there. Okay. I've seen a lot of popular media articles about how occult practices in general are really common and really have a surge during times of difficulty. So times like right now. Is that something that you've seen evidence of over the history of paganism?
Not as such, but I think it's right. And I think it's this magic as a service industry thing. I think when people get desperate, they turn to magic. And I don't know of anybody doing sort of anti-COVID rituals at the moment. Sorry, I can hear an animal in the background doing something it shouldn't do. No, it's a dog or a cat, whatever. And I think people, there's a lot of sort of activism around things like fracking in the British pagan community. road protests. A lot of Druids in the 90s got involved in road protests, stop roads being built. And I think definitely people do kind of turn towards magical practice and turn towards looking to alternative ways of doing things in times like this. I think COVID has just taken everybody by such surprise, you know, that they're not really sort of engaging with it to that extent. But I do know a lot of pagans who are treating this as a kind of retreat period. And they're using it to do their own work because they're in lockdown, because they can't go out, and they're using it to do, you know, astral stuff or, you know, whatever they're doing, really, ceremonial magic.
Interesting, thank you.
Thank you.
There are a couple of people who don't wish to ask questions themselves or haven't given their name, so I can't find them.
I noticed there are some on the chat. I'll just see if I can. Whoops, I can't take that back up. Nope. Okay, yeah, sorry about that. I do apologise if I haven't answered anybody's question, but people are welcome.
We do have quite a few here, and someone else is asking, how do you see the future of paganism looking like? Which
Yeah.
I think is
Yeah. Somebody's just asked about Extinction Rebellion. XR is Extinction Rebellion.
you could possibly put those two questions together.
I could, yeah. I mean, Extinction Rebellion is, as somebody said, very pagan ritual based. It's it's a politically active group. It's an environmental group. So a lot of, you know, in the last 130 years, probably 140 years, a lot of political activism has, like I said with the Fabians, has started to engage with paganism. It's not total, you know, there are a lot of right-wing pagans as well. You know, I don't want to give the impression that it is completely a left-wing thing. It's not. But there are some people who are very active in the activist community and in the pagan community as well. Okay, do you want to pick a question?
Yeah, I think Haley's asked a lot. I'm going to I'll mention a couple here. Where do magic circles and sacred space come from?
Yeah, magic circles. That's really old. And I did actually directly ask Ronald where that came from. And he said he thought it was probably Babylonian. The idea because they're in a very flat place. So, you know, the world around you is a circle. So that's one explanation. I mean, a lot of these things, you know, I suspect they do go back a long way, but we can't prove it. Somebody's asked about ancient sites such as Stonehenge, why they're used in modern practice. Yeah, this is again this sort of antiquity thing. It's older, it's got to be better. And they are numerous places, you know, they've been there a long time. They do have an atmosphere which pagans seem to like to engage with when they can, when they're not under house arrest.
Absolutely. I've got a question in for the chat from Lou Boyd. I'm going to see if Lou wants to answer that question live. Hey, Lou.
Can you hear me?
I can. Hello.
Thank you, Liz. That was great. Yeah, I was just wondering if any of the UK pagan practices have been influenced in any way by post-war immigration from other countries, and particularly from Asia and Africa, and if we've incorporated any sort of pagan or ceremonial magic from those areas.
I think there's some, and it's a thorny question because I think some of it has been quite appropriative. So, you know, I don't want to diss Gerald Gardner too much because he was a product of his day and age. I think he took quite a lot of ideas from Asian and Buddhist thought and incorporated them into Wicca. You know, the idea of karma essentially is one of them, but I'm not sure he really understood it in the same way that a practitioner of the religion in which it appears would understand it. I mentioned voodoo. A lot of younger pagans started taking up voodoo as an interest some years ago. A lot of the younger generation are quite aware of things like cultural appropriation. They're not pretending to be professional voodoo practitioners, hungans, mambos. They are just, you know, doing it. They're not playing around with it, but they're trying, a lot of them are trying not to sort of do the, I've done a weekend workshop and therefore I'm a priestess type thing, which is good. So African ceremonial practice is coming in a little bit more into sort of indigenous British practice, I think. But I think a lot of people are aware of the cultural appropriation side of things. And yeah, rightly, you know, they don't want to nick other people's stuff, especially when there's a big power imbalance in the first place. But that's a really interesting question. And I think somebody actually ought to go into that seriously and write a paper or something on it, because I think there's a lot of potential stuff there that we're possibly not aware of.
Great, thanks, Lou. Also, NC's got a question, and we did end on this question because I'm always in favour of going out into the world instead of just being stuck in my shed. So, NC, you got a question about museums? I'd like to ask it.
Oh yeah,
Hi, there.
Sorry, carry on. Hello.
Hi, Liz. Hello. Thanks for a lovely talk. It was brilliant.
Thank you.
I visited the Boscastle Museum of Witchcraft, and I was wondering if there was anywhere else that's worth visiting to view pagan artifacts.
Occasionally museums put on exhibitions. The Ashmolean did a big one last year. Bristol did one this year, which I was supposed to be going to, and then we suddenly had COVID, so that's just sort of gone. But as a sort of fixed museum, then I think the Boscastle Museum is the place, and it in itself has had a very checkered history. Because it's been all over the place. It was in the Isle of Man for a while, then Gerald Gardner ran it, then I think Cecil Williamson took it over, then it brought it down to Cornwall. It had various adventures in various places, and ended up in Boscastle. So Boscastle is, as far as I'm aware, the main one, but kind of keep an eye out for individual exhibitions and talks with various museums as they come up. There's a surprising amount of them, because I think the museum world and the art world has discovered paganism, and witchcraft, and is starting to do things with it, which is kind of nice and sometimes kind of irritating, but hey, their heart's in the right place. Somebody just mentioned the Pitt Rivers in Oxford. The Pitt Rivers Museum has some great pagan artifacts, and actually I'm still mourning the loss of the Cuming Museum in Southwark.
Oh, yeah.
That had some fantastic stuff, but they had a fire about, what was it, Scott, about 4 years ago now?
Oh, longer than that.
Was it? Oh, God.
I think we might be coming up to a decade, maybe. I'm not sure.
Oh, that's terrible, isn't it?
The Cuming Museum, which was near the Elephant and Castle, was a place of absolute wonders. I was going to mention because I don't know where the line is you draw between a folkloric object to a witchcraft or magical object. There probably isn't. I don't think there's much of a line personally. But there is some stuff in the Horniman Museum, which is near where I live. They've gone so far now as to put a map of the United Kingdom in a little corner of their anthropology section with bits of artifacts that have been picked up from those areas. And I'm sure a lot of museums carry things like that.
Isn't that was that the Horniman family, the Annie Horniman, who was a mover and shaker in the Golden Dawn?
Yeah,
that was that family. Yeah,
exactly,
really interesting. Really interesting. I think we're all just kind of busting to get out and go to some of these places, and
I'm just surprised by the extensive the timeline of it, and there's so little artifacts to show for it.
Yeah, it's
quite surprising.
A lot of stuff. I mean, it tends to be, because a lot of it is a folk religion. Things like John Dee's beautiful alchemical scrying glass, which is actually Aztec. It's an Aztec. God knows where he got it from. It's an Aztec artifact, it's obsidian. That's in the British Museum. Things like that have lasted. But if you think that a lot of cunning folk would have been using stuff in their kitchen, stuff they had around the house, herbs, a lot of that stuff won't have lasted. It's not one of the big religions that has great big statues everywhere. It's which is, it's sad, but it's an interesting thing. Somebody has Helen Cornish, thank you, has just pointed out that the Welcome has a good amulet collection.
Of course, the Welcome.
And the Welcome is amazing, actually. That's a hell of a museum.
I think we've got, we possibly might still have a Welcome librarian in the audience.
Okay, great.
So, hopefully so. Don't be doing well, Ross. I'm going to wrap things up there. Thank you for all your great questions. Thank you for a brilliant talk, Liz. I'm going to share my screen now. One more quick appeal for donations. If you've not donated, Conway Hall is receiving no money whatsoever, and the London Fortean Society is not getting very much either. Do please donate if you haven't already, but thank you if you have. Liz's book is published by Reaction Books, and do please try and get hold of a copy of it. It is brilliant. Reaction is actually a great publisher, and they do some amazing things. Our hashtag is Fortean London. If you want to talk to us about us on Instagram and Twitter, do that. Many thanks to Liz for a great talk. Thank you to everyone for taking part. And good night. Now we go to the pub.
Hi, it's not the same, is it? I'm going to go to the fridge actually, but it's not the same.
It's not the same.
One day soon.
Yeah, we look forward to meeting Liz again in London.
I'd love to.
So thanks everyone, and good night. Thank you.
Good night.